A medieval community deliberately set itself on fire. This is the true story of a city that burned its own buildings to the ground in a desperate attempt to stop the Black Death. By the end, you will understand the shocking psychology behind one of history's most radical survival strategies. What kind of leader would order such a thing, and could such a sacrifice actually work? What would you be willing to burn to save everything you love? Stone buildings and cobbled streets echoed with the sounds of commerce and craft. This was a city alive with purpose, its wealth built on the flow of spices, cloth, and precious metals along well-trodden merchant paths. In the central square, the air was thick with the scent of baking bread and the rhythmic hammering of blacksmiths, while traders from distant lands haggled over exotic goods. Grand houses stood shoulder to shoulder with busy workshops, all protected by formidable walls that promised safety from the outside world. This was a community at the peak of its powers, a vibrant hub that seemed destined for a long and prosperous future. But that very success contained the seeds of its potential downfall. The same trade routes that brought silks and silver also carried invisible threats, and the crowded, bustling lifeblood of the city made it profoundly vulnerable. To grasp the magnitude of the decision that would soon be made, you must first feel the immense value of everything they had built, everything they stood to lose in an instant. The first whispers arrived not as screams of alarm, but as unsettling rumors from the road. Travelers and merchants, their faces drawn with a new kind of fear, brought fragmented tales of a sickness ravaging distant cities. At first, the people of this prosperous city dismissed them as exaggerations, the kind of frightening stories that always seemed to circulate from far away. But the distance between rumor and reality collapsed with terrifying speed. It started in the crowded quarters near the main gates, where merchants and their goods first entered. A sudden, burning fever would strike a perfectly healthy person. Then came the dark, painful swellings in the armpits and groin, the lurid blotches that bloomed on the skin like fatal flowers. Death followed swiftly, often within a matter of days. The city's healers were powerless. Their potions and poultices, trusted for generations, did nothing. The clergy prayed, but the dying continued. Panic began to curdle the air, thick and palpable. This invisible enemy showed no mercy, cutting down the wealthy in their grand houses and the poor in their cramped dwellings with the same brutal indifference. The very streets that once buzzed with life were now haunted by the silent, cloth-draped carts collecting the dead. A collective dread settled over the city, a suffocating realization that their world of stone and commerce offered no protection. This was not a foe that could be fought with swords or walls. It was a shadow, and it was everywhere. Fear was a fertile ground for explanation, and the medieval mind had many seeds to sow. Without the framework of modern germ theory, people grasped for reasons behind the suffering, reaching into the deepest wells of their knowledge. The most powerful and widespread belief was that the plague was divine retribution, a punishment from God for the sins of a fallen world. This interpretation turned the epidemic into a moral crisis, prompting desperate acts of collective piety. Entire towns would organize religious processions, with flagellants marching through the streets, whipping their own backs in a gruesome plea for forgiveness. Yet the dying did not stop. Another prominent theory blamed poisonous air known as miasma. People believed foul odors from swamps, rotting garbage, or even the breath of the sick could carry the disease. This led to attempts to cleanse the atmosphere by burning aromatic woods like pine and juniper, or carrying pouches of sweet-smelling herbs. Some scholars looked to the stars, blaming a catastrophic alignment of planets for corrupting the air itself. These were not foolish ideas for their time. They were the best explanations available, built on centuries of observation and tradition. But when faced with a pestilence as swift and brutal as the Black Death, prayers, perfumes, and star charts proved utterly futile. The very foundation of their understanding was crumbling, leaving a void of terror and helplessness. What do you do when every solution you have ever known has failed, and the world is literally dying around you? This profound crisis of knowledge is what made a previously unthinkable action seem not just plausible but necessary. The city's leaders acted swiftly, imposing a strict quarantine. They designated certain houses and areas outside the walls as places for the sick, hoping to wall the horror away from the healthy. At the same time, the sound of bells filled the air and grand religious processions wound through the streets, a collective plea for heavenly mercy. In every home and shop, people burned fragrant herbs, their smoke a desperate attempt to purify the very atmosphere they breathed. Yet the plague respected none of these boundaries. The ominous rumble of the death cart became the city's most familiar sound, a daily reminder that their best efforts were failing. How do you maintain hope when every prayer seems to go unanswered and every precaution is breached? This crushing realization that their entire world of medicine and faith offered no defense created a vacuum of despair. It was in this suffocating atmosphere of shattered convention that a radical, terrifying idea began to take root. If they could not cure the sickness, perhaps they could burn it out. A desperate silence fell over the council chamber, thick with the scent of fear and smoke from the herbs burning in the corner. The radical proposal hung in the air, as dangerous and volatile as the flames it invoked, to deliberately set their own city on fire. The voices in favor were strained but resolute, arguing that fire was the one element the plague could not ignore. They spoke of creating a firebreak, a scorched earth barrier that would starve the sickness of its fuel. Had not farmers for generations used controlled burns to save their fields from blight, sacrificing a portion to rescue the whole? This, they insisted, was no different. It was a brutal, surgical act of amputation to save the body, but the opposition was visceral and heartbroken. How could they order the destruction of homes their families had lived in for centuries, of workshops that represented a lifetime of labor, of the very church where they had prayed for salvation? They were being asked to become the agents of their own ruin, to burn their history and memories to ash. The debate was a terrible tug of war between two kinds of destruction, one passive and certain, the other active and fraught with risk. Was it better to stand by and watch everything be taken by an invisible enemy, or to take up the torch themselves and destroy a part of it in a desperate gamble to save the rest? The weight of that choice pressed down on every soul in the room, a burden no leader should ever have to carry. The decision to burn their own city was not a simple choice between fire and plague. It was a terrible equation, a balancing of two different kinds of devastation. On one side of the scale sat everything they had built, the material wealth of generations. They were weighing the solid, tangible reality of stone houses, stocked warehouses, and thriving workshops against the invisible, statistical probability of saving human lives. The economic ruin would be absolute and immediate. Destroying the key trade districts near the gates would sever the city's economic arteries, potentially crippling it for decades. Leaders reportedly ordered inventories of the most at-risk areas, creating lists of properties and goods, a heartbreaking ledger of what they might have to sacrifice. There were even discussions of compensation for those who would lose everything, a promise to rebuild, though how such a promise could be kept in the midst of total collapse was a question with no good answer. This pushed the community into a profound ethical confrontation. What is the true worth of a city? Is it in its buildings and its gold, or is it in the people who breathe life into its streets? The social contract between the rulers and the ruled was being tested in the most extreme way imaginable. A leader who protected property while the people died would be cursed forever. Yet a leader who destroyed that property and failed to stop the plague would be remembered as a madman. The gravity of this choice was immense, forcing them to pit the certainty of economic death against the mere chance of physical survival. They were gambling their entire future on a single, desperate roll of the dice. The night air, usually still and silent with dread, now stirred with the grim purpose of moving shadows. Teams of volunteers, their faces set with a terrible resolve, moved through the designated neighborhoods. They carried not weapons but torches and pots of oil, the very tools of their own destruction. When the signal was given, a low horn call that cut through the darkness, the first flames were set. They did not start as a gentle flicker. They leaped into being, hungry and immediate, climbing the wooden frames of houses and devouring the thatched roofs. Within minutes, an unnatural dawn bloomed over the city, an eerie orange glow that painted the undersides of the clouds and cast long, dancing shadows through the streets. The sound was not just the roar of the fire, but a symphony of despair, the crackling of timbers mingling with the choked prayers of the citizens and the raw, aching lamentations for all that was being lost. They watched as a lifetime of memories, the walls that held their joys and sorrows, turned first to glowing embers and then to cold, gray ash. Yet amidst this chaos there was a terrifying order. Other teams, just as determined, stood ready with buckets of water and long hooks, working furiously to contain the inferno to the chosen districts. Cleared streets and pre-soaked buildings acted as fire breaks, a desperate attempt to guide the destruction, to make it surgical. This was not a riot of flame, it was a calculated sacrifice. The heat on their faces was a physical manifestation of their collective will. A statement screamed into the night that they would rather destroy a part of themselves than surrender everything to an unseen foe. In that single, searing moment, they transformed from passive victims into active, if tragic, participants in their own fate. The city was no longer just burning, it was fighting back. Dawn broke over a city transformed into a landscape of ash and smoke. The air remained thick, not with the scent of plague, but with the acrid smell of charred wood and damp, scorched earth. Where bustling districts once stood, only blackened stone foundations remained, their outlines tracing the ghost of a lost neighborhood. The citizens, now refugees in their own home, huddled in makeshift camps in the city's untouched squares and fields. Communal kitchens became the new heart of the community, their simple fires a stark contrast to the destructive inferno of the night before. Here, people shared what little they had, a fragile network of support woven from shared trauma. And then a fragile observation began to circulate, whispered at first, then spoken with growing certainty. The dreaded death carts were not visiting the burned areas anymore. The relentless advance of the plague had, against all odds, appeared to stall at the edge of the scorched earth. This was the first tentative glimmer of hope, a powerful validation that their unimaginable sacrifice might have actually worked. But this hope was immediately tempered by harsh new realities. Food stores had been incinerated along with the warehouses, leading to rationing and the gnawing anxiety of hunger. Arguments flared over property lines that no longer existed, as neighbors confronted the impossible task of proving who owned a pile of rubble. The deepest wound, however, was psychological. The citizens were now haunted by a dual specter, the memory of the plague and the searing image of the flames they themselves had set. Their world had not just been attacked, it had been willingly dismantled. This left them suspended in a strange limbo, grieving for what was gone while desperately clinging to the hope that their loss had purchased a future. They had survived the fire, but the true test of their survival was just beginning. The stark reality of that smoldering dawn is preserved for us in the fragile ink of personal writings. A local monk, his hand likely trembling from more than just the cold, recorded the event in his chronicle. He called it the Great Burning, a deed of both profound tragedy and stark necessity. He wrote of the citizens not as a rioting mob, but as a procession of the grimly determined, their faces lit by the flames of their own homes, their actions fueled by a collective will to survive that transcended individual sorrow. Their resolve, he noted, was as solemn as it was terrible. Meanwhile, the quills of merchants were also busy. In letters meant for business partners in distant ports, they confessed the utter devastation, the warehouses of silk and spice reduced to cinders. Yet amidst these reports of financial ruin, a different, more powerful currency emerges, a fierce pride in their city's radical resolve. One merchant wrote that while others fled or prayed, his city had chosen to fight, to meet the darkness with a cleansing fire. These first-hand accounts are more than historical records. They are windows into the human soul under unimaginable pressure. We hear not the detached analysis of history, but the raw, immediate emotions of people living through each terrifying and hopeful hour. Their words are a powerful reminder that history is not merely a sequence of grand actions and distant decisions. It is the sum of countless individual lives, each one uniquely transformed by the extraordinary circumstances crashing into their world. The monk's chronicle and the merchant's letters give a voice to that collective experience, allowing us to feel the fragile texture of the hope that somehow, against all odds, began to grow from the ashes. While the smoke still hung over one city, countless other communities across Europe were wrestling with the same invisible enemy, each reaching for a different strategy born of desperation and the knowledge of their time. In the great port cities of Italy, a new system emerged from the chaos. Officials in places like Venice and Ragusa noticed that the sickness often arrived on ships, so they began forcing incoming vessels and their crews to anchor in the harbor for a set period before any contact with the shore. This period of isolation was originally 30 days, but it was soon extended to 40, a number steeped in biblical significance. This practice, born of observation and fear, gave the world a powerful new word, quarantine, from the Italian word for 40. It was a logical defense, creating a buffer of time between the outside world and the city, a stark contrast to the immediate, physical destruction of a firebreak. Other towns chose a policy of expulsion, a heartbreaking form of triage. They would forcibly remove the visibly sick from their homes, sending them to isolated buildings called pest houses outside the city walls. These places were less hospitals and more waiting rooms for the dying, a desperate attempt to wall the illness away from the healthy population. It was a strategy of separation, not cure, and it often meant abandoning the infected to a lonely and terrifying fate. At the other extreme, some communities turned to fervent faith, organizing massive pilgrimages to holy sites. They believed that if they could not fight the disease with medicine, they could appeal to a higher power through collective acts of devotion, marching across the countryside in a show of piety they hoped would earn them divine protection. Meanwhile, the wealthiest cities could afford to invest in more personal, though no more effective, solutions. They hired renowned physicians to concoct elaborate protective amulets, often filled with herbs, spices, or even crushed gemstones, and to write out complex recipes for plague-preventing potions. These expensive trinkets and concoctions offered a psychological shield, a tangible thing to buy or do in the face of an unstoppable force, but they did little to stop the actual transmission of the disease. When you place these varied responses side by side, the decision to burn part of a city down stands in stark, radical relief. Quarantines tried to manage the threat through time and distance. Expulsion tried to push the sick away, Prayer tried to transcend the physical world entirely, but the burning was different. It was an admission that the enemy was already inside the walls, deeply embedded in the very fabric of the city itself. It accepted a massive, immediate loss to break the chain of transmission in a way that prayers and perfumes could not. This comparison does not make one city wiser or braver than the others. Instead, it reveals the terrifying puzzle every leader faced, a desperate search for any solution when every known tool had failed. At the heart of this terrifying gamble stood the city's leaders, a council forced to navigate a path between utter ruin and probable annihilation. Their first monumental task was to persuade a terrified population to willingly destroy their own homes. This was not a decree handed down from an isolated palace. It was a brutal truth that had to be communicated with stark honesty and a shared sense of purpose. These leaders, likely merchants and landowners themselves, had to stand before their neighbors and explain that the very foundations of their wealth and security had become a death trap. They framed the unthinkable not as an act of destruction, but as the only remaining strategy for collective survival. They spoke of the fire as a surgeon's knife, a painful but necessary cut to remove a diseased limb and save the body. This appeal to a higher communal good was the only thread of logic that could possibly hold a society on the brink of total collapse. How do you convince people to set their world on fire? You must first convince them that there is a world worth saving on the other side of the flames. The council had to embody a certainty they could not possibly feel, projecting a vision of a future that was, at that moment, pure faith. Their authority was no longer rooted in tradition or wealth, but in their perceived ability to guide the community through an existential darkness. They had to become anchors in a storm of their own making, their resolve the only thing standing between order and total chaos. After the last embers cooled, the true test of their leadership began. The immediate crisis of the plague was replaced by the slow, grinding crisis of survival. The council now faced the monumental challenge of governing a traumatized population living in the ruins of its own past. They had to organize the distribution of scarce food, settle disputes over property lines that were now just piles of ash, and manage the profound grief and shock that gripped every citizen. This was a leadership of practical triage and profound empathy. They had to be accountants counting the remaining sacks of grain, judges mediating arguments between neighbors who had lost everything, and counselors offering solace to the bereaved all at once. Their legitimacy now depended entirely on their ability to deliver on the promise implicit in the fire, the promise of a chance to rebuild. They had to transition from architects of a controlled catastrophe to the engineers of a fragile recovery. This required a different kind of courage, not the boldness of a single desperate night, but the enduring stamina to face day after day of hardship without losing hope. The lesson from their ordeal is timeless. True crisis leadership is not about making popular decisions. It is about making necessary ones and then bearing the full weight of the consequences. It is about uniting people not around a common enemy, but around a shared, almost impossible goal. In our own times of upheaval, the echoes of their desperate resolve remind us that leadership, at its most essential, is the courage to hold a community together when everything seems designed to tear it apart. The true cost of the fire was tallied not in the heat of the flames, but in the cold light of the following months. The city's economic heart, once beating strong in the districts near the gates, was now silent ash. Warehouses that had held spices from the east and fine cloth from the north were gone. The workshops of master craftsmen, filled with specialized tools and half-finished goods, had vanished into smoke. This was not just property damage, it was a systemic collapse. The city's wealth, built over generations, had been physically liquidated in a single night. Rebuilding from such a foundation of loss required a staggering investment. The communal treasury, already strained, now had to fund the clearing of rubble and the sourcing of timber and stone, diverting precious coins from every other civic need. This massive financial effort became a test of their collective resolve, a shared burden that would define their future for years to come. For the merchant class, the fire was a brutal reckoning. Some, whose entire capital was tied up in those lost goods, found themselves utterly ruined. They became dependent on the community they had once helped lead, a painful reversal of fortune. Yet, in the face of this devastation, a fascinating economic adaptation began to emerge. Other merchants, those who had lost their physical shops but not their networks of contacts, were forced to innovate. They could no longer rely on storing goods for foreign traders, so they pivoted, becoming mobile agents who brokered deals between distant cities, operating from temporary stalls in undamaged squares. They found new, less conventional trade routes or shifted to dealing in different, more available products. The destruction of the old economic order, while catastrophic, had forcibly cleared the ground for new ventures. This painful renewal created unexpected opportunities. A sudden, urgent demand for builders, carpenters, and stonemasons meant that skilled laborers who may have struggled for work before now found their expertise in high demand. The suppliers of raw materials, from local quarries to forests, saw a surge in business. The economy was, in a raw and difficult way, being redistributed and rewired. The fire had been an act of sheer survival, but the long recovery became a deliberate act of reinvention. It proved that a city is more than its buildings. It is the resilience and adaptability of the people within them, capable of transforming even the deepest catastrophe into a reluctant catalyst for a different kind of future. From the ashes of their former lives, a new kind of community began to take shape. Shared loss became a powerful currency, binding survivors together in ways that prosperity never could. A family who had lost their home might find shelter in the barn of a neighbor whose house still stood. Communal kitchens, once a temporary measure, evolved into central hubs where recipes and resources were pooled without hesitation. The very act of burning their own city, a collective decision of unimaginable weight, created an unbreakable bond among those who had endured it. They were no longer just neighbors living on the same street. They were fellow veterans of a terrible war against an invisible enemy, united by a trauma that only they could fully understand. This forged a powerful sense of identity, a communal spirit rooted in the stark realization that their survival depended entirely on mutual support. The responsibility for one another, once an abstract ideal, became a daily, practical necessity. This reinforced solidarity would become the invisible blueprint for the city's physical reconstruction, the moral foundation upon which every new stone would be laid. Yet this newfound unity was not without its fault lines. A subtle but palpable tension simmered between those who had watched their property burn and those whose homes and shops had been spared. The families who had sacrificed everything sometimes looked with quiet resentment upon their neighbors who, through sheer luck of geography, had lost nothing. Was their suffering not greater? Did their sacrifice not entitle them to a greater share of the community's support? These unspoken questions threatened to fray the social fabric they were so desperately trying to mend. The city's leaders, now acting as both planners and peacemakers, had to navigate this delicate landscape with immense care. They worked to ensure that aid was distributed fairly, that voices from all sectors were heard, and that the narrative remained one of collective survival, not comparative loss. They mediated disputes over land use and rebuilding priorities, constantly reinforcing the idea that every citizen, whether they had lost a mansion or a single tool, was essential to the city's future. In this way, the crisis became a crucible. The intense heat of shared tragedy did not simply melt the community away, it forged it into something stronger and more resilient. The values of solidarity and mutual responsibility, tempered in the fire, became the enduring legacy of their sacrifice, proving that a city is not just made of stone and timber, but of the unbreakable bonds between the people who call it home. Out of the ashes arose a new understanding of what it meant to keep a city healthy. The old methods of simply carrying sweet herbs to ward off foul air were no longer enough. The trauma of the plague and the fire had seared a simple, powerful lesson into the civic consciousness that filth and crowding were a mortal danger. This realization sparked a wave of practical, citywide reforms. New ordinances were passed, demanding that household waste be disposed of in designated pits far from living areas, rather than simply tossed into the streets. The maintenance of public wells became a matter of urgent civic duty, with regular cleanings to ensure the water supply was as pure as possible. Authorities also took a more systematic approach to the sick. Instead of simply barricading people inside their homes, they established designated isolation buildings on the city's outskirts. These structures were deliberately placed where the wind could move freely through them, a conscious effort to disperse the stagnant, corrupted air they believed carried disease. While they still spoke in terms of miasma and bad humors, their actions were unknowingly targeting the real culprits, bacteria and viruses, by breaking the chains of transmission through cleanliness and separation. This was public health in its most embryonic form, a set of rules born not from abstract science, but from the brutal, first-hand observation of survival. How do you prevent a nightmare from returning? You change the very world you live in, one street and one regulation at a time. Alongside these official measures, a quieter revolution was happening in the notebooks of local healers and apothecaries. The desperate experiments of the plague years, the herbal teas that seemed to ease a fever or the poultices that appeared to reduce swelling, were now carefully written down and shared. This was no longer just oral tradition. It was the beginning of a documented body of local medical knowledge. Certain plants like wormwood or rue were widely recommended for their protective qualities, and preventive practices, such as the thorough washing of hands and face after visiting a public market, became common household advice. These innovations, from the grand civic project of clean streets to the humble family ritual of washing up, all trace their roots back to that moment of ultimate crisis. The city's great sacrifice did more than just halt an epidemic. It forced a leap in collective thinking. It proved that even without understanding the microscopic world, a community could still learn, adapt, and build a safer environment from the lessons of its own suffering. Centuries after the last embers cooled, the silence of the earth began to speak. Modern archaeologists, working with trowels and brushes, have peeled back the layers of time to uncover the city's darkest hour. They found a distinct dark band in the soil, a stratum of ash and charcoal that cuts through the history of the settlement like a scar. This is the physical evidence of the Great Fire, a geological truth that confirms the agonizing stories passed down through generations. Within this layer of destruction, the past becomes heartbreakingly tangible. A small, melted silver coin, its features blurred by extreme heat, tells of a merchant's purse lost in the chaos. The charred remains of a wooden bowl, perhaps half full of a meal that was never eaten, offers a silent, intimate glimpse into a life interrupted. These are not just artifacts, they are frozen moments of a single, catastrophic day. By analyzing the way the metals melted and the timbers were consumed, scientists can map the fire's ferocity and its path through the streets. They can determine which buildings burned hottest and which materials vaporized completely, creating a thermal fingerprint of the city's sacrifice. This archaeological record does more than verify an old story. It gives weight and substance to the collective courage of a people who chose a controlled inferno over certain plague. Every shard of blackened pottery, every nail twisted by the heat, is a silent witness to the price they were willing to pay for a future they could only hope to see. But the stark historical truth of the fire could not survive for long in its raw, painful form. As years turned into decades and then centuries, the story began to change, softening its sharp edges and gathering the shimmering cloak of legend. One persistent tale tells of a humble nun who received a divine vision, a command from an angel to cleanse the city with a holy fire. In this version, the burning was not a desperate human gamble but a sacred act of obedience, transforming the council's agonizing decision into a matter of faith. Another popular story speaks of a miracle in the midst of the inferno, claiming that just as the flames threatened to leap the firebreaks and consume the entire city, a sudden, drenching rain fell from a cloudless sky, saving the untouched districts. This was not a random weather event, it was divine intervention, a sign that their sacrifice had been seen and approved from on high. These myths offered profound comfort, reframing a collective trauma as a moment of spiritual triumph. Folktales also sprouted from the ashes, whispered around hearths for generations. There were rumors of a wealthy merchant who had buried his entire fortune of gold coins beneath his cellar floor just before the flames took his house, a treasure that was never recovered. To this day, some say, on certain quiet nights, you can see the faint, shimmering outlines of the old, burned streets and hear the phantom echoes of the citizens who walked them. Other stories tell of ghostly apparitions, not of the plague victims, but of the fire tenders themselves, forever standing guard over the city they saved. These narratives, while not fact, served a crucial purpose. They were the community's way of processing an event too large and terrible to hold in simple memory. By weaving the historical event with divine purpose and local mystery, they transformed a story of loss into a foundational epic. The burning was no longer just something that happened to them. It became a core part of who they were, a shared myth that gave profound, lasting meaning to their ancestors' unimaginable sacrifice. The psychological aftermath of the fire was a ghost that walked in daylight. For the survivors, the trauma did not end when the last embers died. Many were haunted by vivid, recurring nightmares, jolting awake to the phantom smell of smoke and the crackle of flames that existed only in their memories. During the day, a sudden loud noise, the slam of a door or the cry of a market vendor, could trigger a paralyzing fear, a heart-pounding reliving of that terrible night. This constellation of symptoms, the anxiety, the hypervigilance, the intrusive memories, is what modern psychology would clearly identify as post-traumatic stress. Their minds had been seared as surely as the earth had been, yet from this profound psychological wound, a strange and powerful countercurrent also emerged. Many survivors spoke of a renewed, almost piercing appreciation for the simple fact of being alive. A sunrise, the taste of fresh bread, the laughter of a child. These ordinary moments were now felt with a new and profound intensity. Having stared into the abyss of total loss, they found a deeper gratitude for the fragile gift of existence. This often manifested as a strengthened, more personal religious faith. Their prayers were no longer just rituals for communal salvation, but intimate conversations of thanks for a second chance, a hard-won belief that they had been spared for a purpose. This shared, searing experience forged a unique collective memory, a mental landmark for every person in the city. When future hardships arose, a poor harvest or a harsh winter, they did not have to wonder if they could endure. They had a definitive answer. They had already survived the fire. This collective resilience became their bedrock, a story they told themselves about who they were, a people tested by the absolute extreme. To understand the full human cost of their decision, you must look beyond the charred stone and the lost coins. You must see the invisible scars and the hard-won strength that lived on in the minds and hearts of the people, the true, enduring legacy of the flames. The reconstruction was more than just rebuilding what was lost. It was a chance to reimagine the city itself. With the charred districts now a blank slate, urban planners, though they would not have called themselves that, enacted sweeping changes guided by the brutal lessons of the plague. Where narrow, shadowy alleys had once trapped foul air and crowds, they laid out new, wider streets. This was a deliberate strategy, not for grand processions but for ventilation. They believed fresh, moving air could sweep away the miasma that bred sickness, and in doing so, they unintentionally created avenues where sunlight could penetrate and fires would have a harder time jumping from one building to the next. For the first time, zoning became a matter of public health. They relocated tanneries, slaughterhouses, and other foul-smelling industries to the city's outskirts, far from residential neighborhoods. This separation of living spaces from sources of contamination was a revolutionary step, a tangible effort to wall off the everyday causes of disease. Public squares, once cramped and overcrowded, were deliberately expanded. These new open spaces served as communal lungs for the city, places where people could gather without being pressed tightly together, reducing both the fear and the reality of contagion. Even the very materials of the city changed. New building codes often mandated stone and tile over wood and thatch, making the city not only more fire-resistant but also easier to keep clean. The goal was to create an environment that was inherently more defensible, a city that could resist both flame and pestilence by its very design. This transformation reveals a profound truth about human resilience. A catastrophe does not have to be the end of a story. It can be a brutal, painful reset, a chance to correct the mistakes of the past. The citizens did not just reconstruct their homes, they built a smarter, more durable habitat, proving that from the ashes of disaster, a stronger, wiser community can rise. The plague's grip on the city began to loosen. In the weeks following the Great Burning, the relentless march of the disease slowed to a crawl. The haunting sound of the death cart's wheels grew less frequent, and the terrible lists of the dead grew shorter each day. People tentatively emerged from their shelters, their faces gaunt but their eyes holding a fragile new light. Life did not return to what it was before. That world was gone forever, but it began to stitch itself into a new and cautious pattern. Markets reopened with smaller, local goods. The sounds of children playing, once silenced by fear, began to echo in the undamaged squares. This gradual return to a semblance of normalcy felt nothing short of miraculous. For the survivors, the connection was undeniable and deeply personal. The fire had been their most extreme act, and the plague had retreated in its wake. They saw a direct line from their sacrifice to their salvation, a conviction that solidified into unshakable truth. Yet, centuries later, historians and epidemiologists look back at this moment with a more measured gaze. The Black Death was a complex phenomenon that moved in waves, often receding for reasons that are still debated. Was it the fire that broke the chain of transmission by eliminating the rats and fleas that carried the bacteria? Or did the epidemic simply burn itself out, having infected the most susceptible and run its natural course? Perhaps a combination of factors was at play, from changing seasons to the development of immunity in the surviving population. The precise contribution of that single, fiery night may never be fully quantified. But the perception of its success was, in its own way, just as powerful as any scientific fact. The community believed with every fiber of their being that their courageous and terrible decision had saved them. This belief became the cornerstone of their identity, a story they told their children and their children's children. It transformed a traumatic memory of destruction into a foundational epic of resilience, proving that in the human heart, a story of survival can be forged from even the most devastating of fires. That single fiery night ignited a debate that would burn for centuries. Was this desperate act a moral abomination or a tragic necessity? In the years that followed, medieval theologians wrestled with this very question, their quills scratching late into the night by candlelight. They turned to the ancient principle of the greater good, arguing that an action normally considered a grave sin could be permissible if it was the only way to prevent a far greater evil. To them, the fire was a form of spiritual triage, a heartbreaking but justifiable choice to save the soul of the community, even if it meant sacrificing its physical body. This was not a clean or easy answer. It was a heavy burden of moral calculus weighed in the shadow of the gallows. How do you judge an action when every possible choice leads to suffering? The value of a single home, a single life, had to be measured against the survival of the entire city. This same agonizing puzzle resonates powerfully in our own time. Modern ethicists still use this case as a stark example of utilitarian thinking, where the morality of an action is determined by its outcome. The goal is to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number, a cold but compelling logic that guides impossible choices in public health and disaster management. Imagine a modern pandemic where a government must decide between a crippling, economy-wide lockdown or the unchecked spread of a deadly virus. The calculus is hauntingly familiar, trading certain immediate hardship for the chance to save countless lives. Or consider the dilemma of a firefighter in a wildfire who must deliberately burn a strip of forest to create a firebreak, sacrificing a part of the landscape to save the whole town beyond it. These are not medieval problems, they are human ones. The story of the burning city forces us to ask where we would draw the line. Does a state of emergency grant leaders the right to suspend normal moral rules? What safeguards are necessary to prevent such power from being abused in the name of necessity? The citizens who set their own world ablaze left us with no simple answers, only a profound and enduring challenge to our understanding of collective responsibility, a question that smolders quietly in every modern crisis, waiting for the winds of circumstance to make it flame once more. The drama of that fiery night refused to be confined to history books. It leaped from the pages of monks' chronicles and into the vibrant colors of medieval manuscript illuminations. In these early images, the flames often appear as divine instruments, licking at buildings under a watchful, judgmental eye from heaven. The burning is depicted not merely as a human act, but as a form of collective purification, a necessary scourging for the community's sins. The artists of this era framed the event through a lens of faith, transforming a desperate survival tactic into a powerful moral lesson about punishment and redemption. Then, centuries later, Renaissance painters picked up the brush with a different focus. They turned their gaze from the heavens and onto the human faces in the crowd. Their canvases are filled with the raw emotion of the moment, the anguish of a mother clutching her children, the determined resolve of the men holding the torches, the terrified confusion of livestock. These works emphasize the individual drama within the collective catastrophe, exploring the personal cost of an impossible decision. The story's power only grew in the modern era, finding new life in sprawling historical novels that delved into the psychological torment of the leaders, intense film scenes that capture the eerie glow of the flames against a terrified populace, and even in grand operas where the music itself seems to weep and roar with the citizens. Each of these reinterpretations is a mirror held up to the time of its creation. A 19th-century novelist might frame the burning as a triumph of rational civic duty over superstition, while a 20th-century filmmaker might see in it a chilling parallel to the scorched earth tactics of modern warfare. Why does this single event hold such enduring fascination for artists? It provides a perfect crucible for exploring timeless human themes: sacrifice, community, the limits of authority, and the fragile line between destruction and salvation. These artistic works do more than just illustrate a historical fact. They become part of the history itself. They ensure the memory of the city's choice is not forgotten, while constantly allowing each new generation to find its own meaning in the smoke and the ashes. The echoes of that medieval fire reach across the centuries into our own world of instant communication and advanced medicine. While we no longer blame planetary alignments for disease, the fundamental social and ethical puzzles from that time have not vanished, they have only evolved. The medieval city's ordeal underscores a timeless truth that managing a pandemic is as much about managing people as it is about managing a pathogen. Their desperate unity in the face of a common enemy highlights the indispensable role of community solidarity. When trust breaks down and individuals act only for themselves, even the most scientifically perfect containment strategy can fail. Their collective sacrifice, as extreme as it was, serves as a powerful historical example of a population willing to endure immense personal hardship for the perceived good of all. This kind of social cohesion is not something that can be manufactured in a crisis. It must be nurtured long before an emergency begins. Yet the story also lays bare the immense difficulty of implementing drastic measures. The city council did not just issue an order, they had to persuade, cajole, and lead their terrified citizens into an act of self-destruction. This mirrors the modern challenge of enforcing lockdowns, travel restrictions, or mandatory vaccinations. How do you secure public compliance when the prescribed cure feels as disruptive as the disease itself? The answer often lies in the clarity and consistency of communication. The medieval leaders, in their own way, had to be transparent about the grim reality and the even grimmer alternative. They framed the fire not as random destruction, but as a strategic necessity for survival. In our era of 24-hour news cycles and social media, clear, honest, and empathetic messaging from authorities is just as critical to maintain public trust and guide behavior during a prolonged crisis. We have traded torches for testing kits and miasma theory for molecular biology, but the core dilemma remains starkly familiar. How do we balance the sacred autonomy of the individual with the urgent needs of the collective? The medieval city answered with fire, a solution we would never choose today, but their story forces us to confront the same difficult questions in our own terms. It reminds us that our pandemic response plans must include not just stockpiles of medicine and protocols for hospitals, but also strategies for building social trust, for communicating with compassion, and for navigating the profound ethical terrain where individual freedoms meet communal survival. The true lesson is not in the method they used, but in the depth of the human challenge they faced. A challenge that, in its essence, is always with us. Centuries later, the city's streets still whisper the story of the fire. You can find its legacy etched not just in historical records, but in the very soul of the modern community. A simple, solemn monument stands in a central square, often just a single flame-shaped obelisk carved with the year of the Great Burning. Every year, on the anniversary of that fateful night, the city holds a ceremony of remembrance. Bells toll not in alarm, but in a slow, respectful rhythm, and citizens gather not in panic, but in quiet reflection. The heart of this event is not a reenactment of the flames, but a communal lighting of candles, a symbolic echo that transforms an act of destruction into one of enduring light and hope. This is how a traumatic event is woven into the fabric of a people's identity, becoming a timeless lesson passed from one generation to the next. School children here don't just learn about kings and battles, they learn about the day their ancestors chose fire over despair, a story that teaches them about the profound meaning of sacrifice and communal responsibility. This is not history trapped in a book, it is a living, breathing part of who they are. How does a community carry the weight of such a memory without being crushed by it? The answer lies in this careful, deliberate act of remembrance, which honors the loss while celebrating the resilience that was born from it. For historians, the story is never truly finished. Each generation of scholars brings new questions to the old evidence. Economic historians pore over tax records from before and after the fire, tracing the long-term financial shockwaves. Social historians analyze the council meeting notes and personal diaries, looking for the voices of ordinary people, the women, the servants, the laborers whose perspectives were often left out of the official chronicles. Archaeologists continue to sift through the soil, and with new technologies like soil chemistry analysis, they can now pinpoint the exact locations of long-vanished wooden structures, creating a digital map of the lost neighborhoods. This relentless pursuit of understanding refines the narrative, adding nuance and depth, ensuring the city's story becomes ever more rich and complete. The legacy, therefore, is a complex and layered one. There is immense, undeniable pride in the collective courage displayed, a foundational pride that fuels the city's spirit. Yet right beside it lives a deep, abiding sorrow for the homes, the heirlooms, and the lives that were part of the price paid. This is not a contradiction, but a mature understanding of history, an acceptance that profound strength and profound loss can exist in the same space, forever intertwined. This ongoing engagement with a pivotal moment shows us how the past actively shapes the present. The values of solidarity and sacrifice, forged in that terrible fire, continue to inform how the city faces modern challenges, creating an unbroken, living connection between the citizens of today and the ghosts of that smoky, decisive night. Even with all we know, the story of the burning city is filled with profound silences. Historians still fiercely debate the exact boundaries of the inferno. Did the flames consume a few critical blocks near the main gates, or did they rage through a third of the entire city? The answer changes the scale of the sacrifice and the economic shockwaves that followed. We also lack a precise death toll. How many perished from the plague before the fire, and how many, if any, were lost in the controlled blaze itself? The records from that chaotic period are tragically incomplete, leaving us with estimates rather than certain numbers. Perhaps the most haunting unknown is the specific decision-making process inside the council chamber. Were the leaders unanimous, or was the vote dangerously split? What final, unrecorded argument tipped the scales toward an action that defied all conventional wisdom? These are not just academic puzzles, they are the human details that would allow us to fully understand the weight of that choice. Fortunately, the tools for answering these questions are evolving. Modern archaeology is no longer just about digging. Researchers now use ground-penetrating radar to map buried foundations without moving a single stone, revealing the ghostly outlines of streets erased by the flames. Soil chemistry analysis can detect the faint, lingering signature of intense heat, pinpointing the fire's epicenter with astonishing accuracy. And digital historians are beginning to construct virtual models of the medieval city, allowing them to run simulations. They can test the wind patterns on that fateful night, or model how the plague might have spread through the crowded alleyways, offering a data-driven glimpse into the desperation the leaders faced. This relentless pursuit of understanding ensures the story is never truly finished. Each new scrap of evidence, each technological breakthrough, adds another layer of depth to our comprehension. The burning of the city is not a closed case in a history book. It is a living inquiry, a testament to our enduring need to find meaning in the most extreme acts of the human spirit. The story of this city's fiery sacrifice is far more than a dramatic footnote in a history book. It stands as a profound testament to human resilience, a raw demonstration of what a community can endure when confronted with an impossible choice. Throughout history, societies have repeatedly faced these terrible forks in the road, moments where every path forward is paved with loss. What makes this story so compelling is not just the scale of the destruction, but the courage it took to willingly become the agents of that destruction for a greater good. They chose a controlled catastrophe over a random, complete annihilation. This legacy echoes through the centuries, not as a blueprint for action, but as a timeless lesson in the nature of leadership, the meaning of sacrifice, and the indomitable strength of the human spirit when it bands together. As we reflect on this remarkable chapter, we are left with a powerful, lingering question for our own lives. In our modern world, facing our own complex crises, could we summon even a fraction of that same collective courage and compassion? The story does not demand we replicate their methods, but it challenges us to match their resolve. Thank you for joining this exploration of one of history's most dramatic and defining acts of collective survival.